let's talk a little bit more about shorting. So, is shorting ethical? Is it ethical to short stocks or other assets? Well, let's talk a little bit about it. First is something called the uptick rule. And the idea is that psychology and other factors are such that people don't really panic buy, but they do panic sell. And so when stock prices are dropping dramatically, it is sometimes the case that more sell orders come in and the stock price drops even more. And so you will see, in theory, people who attempt to manipulate the market by placing a very large, very sudden short position, which causes the price to go down. Other people panic. This causes the price to go down even more, and they get to cover at a much lower price. And so this type of short sale would be a market manipulation. And so to stop this in 1938, they put in something called the uptick rule. And the uptick rule says that a sell order that initiates a short position, and the way they know this is that the broker knows your position before they submit the order, and so the broker is the one who is responsible for ensuring that this rule is followed, that a sell order that initiates a short position can only be executed if the most recent trade was above or at the prior trade. And so a sell order which initiates a short position can't follow a downtick. It can only follow an uptick or a flat tick, and this is known as the uptick rule. And it went into effect in 1938. It was removed in 2007, but it was reinstated in 2010, but now applies only if a security is down 10% more from its previous day's close. Then the uptick rule goes into effect and you cannot initiate a short. What about in the context of the housing bubble? Well, what would happen if you could short better? So you can't really short houses or other physical assets. A guy named John Paulson made a fortune during the housing bubble by shorting houses using the derivatives markets. The same thing in the Big Short. We talked about this very early in the semester. Arguably, if short position derivatives, the credit default swaps, were correctly priced, then this would have limited demand for mortgage-backed securities, this would have limited mortgages, this would have limited money available to buy houses, and this might have limited the bubble. And so a more efficient market in which you can short, and remember the whole tension of the movie The Big Short was how difficult it was to take a short position in houses. Arguably, this might have mitigated the housing bubble if you could have shorted more easily. Herbalife and William Ackerman, he is a hedge fund manager who thought that Herbalife was overvalued and took a very long short position in this stock, and you can read about that if you click this link. And the line is that the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent, and that may or may not have been John Maynard Keynes. Let's talk about a short squeeze. So if the entity that lent you the shares to go short later decides that they would like to sell those shares, because having lent you the shares, since they are still owed the shares and since you are still paying dividends, they are effectively economic long the stock. But if they later decide they'd like to sell the shares, then they can require that you return the shares to them so that they can sell them. So you either need to borrow from some other entity to return them or buy them back in the market to return them. If you're unable to borrow them again and are required to buy them back, but there is a low supply of the shares to buy, then the price will increase. So you're short and the price is increasing dramatically. This is called a short squeeze. And this, of course, benefits the entity that lent you the shares because they are economically long, and you are driving the price up because they are requiring you to buy them. In a large enough market, it's very difficult for a single entity to initiate a short squeeze. One of the things we can look at is how large are the short positions. And so we can calculate something called the short interest. This is the number of shares that have been borrowed or sold short. The short interest ratio is the short interest divided by the number of shares outstanding. And so this is the short interest divided by the number of shares outstanding. The days to cover. This is the short interest divided by the average daily float. And the average daily float is the number of shares traded each day. And so if the number of shares outstanding relative to the average daily float is very large, then it can be very difficult to buy back the shares. And this would be some estimation of how long it would take for everyone who is short to buy them back if all of the sales in each day were buying to cover a short position. And here is a list of stocks with very high short interest ratios. And here's a little story of how a short interest ratio can actually exceed 100%, meaning that the number of shares that have been shorted is greater than the number of shares outstanding. And the way that works is I borrow and then I sell short, and then the entity to whom I sold them, I borrow again and sell short again. And so then you can actually have more than 100% short interest ratio. So should I lend my stock out so it can be sold short? Is this a smart thing to do? If I own stock, if I lend it out and someone else is going to sell it, it's going to put downward pressure on the stock's price. So if I'm running an actively managed portfolio, if I'm a professional investor and I'm running an actively managed portfolio, lending it to a short will put downward pressure on the price. So exchange traded funds, an ETF is a passively managed fund, and it owns all the stocks within a particular index. And if the managers of the ETF, they are less concerned about the direction of the fund because people aren't investing in their fund because of their stock picking skill. They're investing in the fund because they want to hold the index. And so ETF managers are very willing to lend out shares, and this is an important source of revenue for exchange-traded funds. And it can dramatically lower the cost of investing in the ETF because the investors buy the stock, but the managers have the ability to lend out the shares. And so as a result, stocks that are a part of a major index are very easy and very inexpensive to borrow and short.